That's a huge difference. Because if we're going to invest in the library of the future, that's what we want. We don't simply want the old library with Grep running over it. We want something a little more adventurous than that, and we haven't got that yet, I think. So my way, I think, of thinking about what went wrong is to quote from the admirable George Bush and say it was a case of misunderestimation. I think that they didn't really understand what the problem was, and some evidence for that, other than things like how they're describing the project before it got underway to me. When Jeff Numberg, my colleague, was actually describing some of the rotten metadata in Google, a librarian stood up and said, a senior librarian, and said, don't worry about odd broken metadata, you can find that book another way. And when I made a few remarks about Google Books, and Jeff as well, in fact, a rather sort of critical historian who dislikes almost everything I say about Google, wrote online, Google Books is wonderful, it saved me many a trip to the library and a lot through interlibrary learning. And I hung my head, and I thought, if that's really what we've invested, huge resources, because libraries have invested, not just Google, and all we're getting is a way to save trips to the library, the odd serendipitous finding on search, that's a pretty sad outcome. Because, as I think others have argued, this is probably a once and for all scanning. Put Dan Clancy to the wall again and he will admit, though you have to push him quite hard, nobody is ever likely to take this task on again. Google has squeezed that space out. Okay, so it's also starved a lot of other scholarly endeavors. I've talked to major research centers with a huge amount of money whose directors are saying to them, give up that scanning, Google is doing it. So people with particular domain expertise are actually being told to stop because a bunch of people who have no domain expertise at all are going to do it better. And in fact, if you look in the Google settlement, one of the things they're claiming is they're going to start building on the fly sub-corpora so that they can actually sell these to libraries at a slightly lower price. So they're going to decide what is a domain, what's a topic, and what are the books inside it using the metadata they've built. And that, again, to me is a pretty worrying concept. The other thing I think we have to worry about, while I seem to be so critical, is also that Google might give up, and then we're left with a half-finished project, badly executed, but nobody else willing to take on. And I say that because, and Brandon again may well deny this, but if you look some of the people at Google in the eye, there's a real look of fear about what this has taken on and how much it has cost. And if you ask them how much it cost, they usually wouldn't tell you. But it frightened them, as far as I can tell. And I talked to several people. So then the question, well, why it went wrong? If I'm right that that's kind of what's wrong, why did it go wrong? Well, I think one of the things is a splendidly naive romanticism. They actually thought books were a whole lot easier than they really are, because books look deceptively easy. Now, can you call those hard-headed engineers splendidly naive romantics? Well, this is a little unfair, but let me just say one reason why they often start off in one direction before you get course correction. Currently, the predominant business model for commercial search engines is advertising. The goals of the advertising business model do not always correspond to providing quality search to users. We expect that advertising-funded search engines will be inherently biased towards the advertisers and away from the needs of the consumers. Search engine bias is particularly insidious. But we'll all recognize those words written by Page and Brin in their outline for the Google search tool. Or you get Ken Aletta talking to Sergey Brin, and he said, Brin said, people don't buy books anymore, you should put your books online for free. And so Aletta asked him, who would pay me the salary to work on the book? Who would pay for my trips to Google, including airfare, hotel and car? Who would edit the book? Who would do the tour and the marketing? Who would prepare the index, etc., etc.? By the end of my questions, Brin wanted to change the subject. The reason, I think, is that he has innocent faith in the internet and adequate knowledge about how books are published. So, these people are enormously smart, but when you hear them talk about books, you shudder a little. Brin's own article, which he was writing about while we were actually collectively at a conference in New York about Google Library, what was his validation for the library? Because in 1916, I think he found a reference to an electric car. And And that idea that what we've really got is just some serendipitous dipping tool that can pull out little facts, and that again makes the whole project frivolous beyond all measure. Now, one of the reasons I think that this is problematic, and I want to go back to what I said before, is that my experience of working in Silicon Valley for 10 or 12 years, of being around engineers a lot, is that there's a very deep conviction that you can divide the world into resources and constraints. And what a good engineering solution does is it removes the constraint and you're left with the resource. But so often the world doesn't divide easily that way. And the paper in books is one example in which it doesn't. And when we start to see the issues that come about when you try to remove, I mean, let's remember, I think in 1909 is the first example of someone saying that within a couple of years we're going to have newspapers without paper. And we're still battling at it a century later, and we still haven't got there, and nobody knows what the business model will be. And even people in Google News, who I know very well, are absolutely perplexed about what the future is. So that idea that you can just suddenly remove constraints and end up with resources, I think, is deep. And I think that that goes along with two enormously powerful but also problematic engineering traits, or one really. And that is the notion of a proof of concept. That is, I can concept something with the tools I've got, and because I've got a very smart team, which will show you how this will work. And at that point, a lot of the very best engineers tend to walk away. And that's why things remain eternally beta. Because actually the hard, tedious work of saying, well, how do you actually get from proof of concept to really serious execution can hang around for a long while. Let me just give one brief example, and I know this will drive Dan crazy, because he asked for scientific proof, and I don't have scientific proof. It's all purely anecdotal. But let me tell you one case in which I crossed swords with some of the people at Google. Not cross swords, it was enjoyable encounter, but they put up on the Google blog their latest new idea. I don't think Brandon's involved in this, so I think I can say it without causing offense. Where they said, we can pick illustrations out of books and put them on the cover. And boy, won't that look pretty for all those illustrated 19th century books. And sure, it looked pretty, and there on the Google book blog were 4 examples of books that they've done this with. The first one was a book called Foreign Butterflies. The Ceinture Aventure Aérienne was about balloons in France. And the third was Studies in American Fungi. All 3 were misidentified. The first one had probably the wrong title and probably missed all the series information that went along with it. The second one, that was also, although it was in fact a book on butterflies in the 19th century, that was classified as juvenile non-fiction. The one about ballooning in France in the 18th century was also classified as juvenile non-fiction, and the Studies of American Fungi was classified as cooking. I then looked inside the book, because this was now not only were looking to see, well, did they get the information from the title page right? And no, but if they're boasting about the illustrations, let's have a look at the illustrations, and you go to the first illustration, and of course it's a folded illustration. And Google can't photograph folded illustrations, so all you get is this sort of mess of folding. So then I discovered what the real skill behind the algorithm was going into the book and finding the illustrations that Google hadn't botched and putting those on the cover. But the thing then was that I pointed this out on a list which I share with several people from Google. And what was intriguing to me was they immediately went and changed the name and the author of the book. And they got it even worse. My idea was really that they didn't know they were wrong in the first place, and they used this book to boast about how skillful they were. That book was up there because they wanted to say, look what a good job we can do. And when I pointed out there was a problem with that, they rushed to fix it, and they didn't know what they were doing when they fixed it, so they fixed it, so they made both the title and the author even worse than it was before. And that is a sense that they don't really... And what was intriguing then was the complaints I got about my complaint, because the first person said, what on earth are you doing looking inside this book? As if that was some kind of outrageous behavior. And then the second one, which I'm sure that Randall would be understand, was somebody said, for heaven's sake, this is just an engineer, they say. Well now, the first point is, nobody says about someone at Google that they're just an engineer. It's like someone is just a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies. It doesn't work that way. But anyway, the point was is that Google has a lot of very clever ideas. The latest one, which I love, because Google has chaos in dealing with multi-volume works, is that they've got this very nice idea. If you find it in